Hello, my name is Tim Lawrence. I'm the Edexcel Psychology Subject Advisor, and welcome to this recorded version of the exam feedback training on the summer 2022 exams. Now, we delivered this live in November 2022 with many excellent questions being asked by teachers on the Q&A, and we decided, having got some additional input from our senior examiners, that we would do some recorded versions, a video for each of the three papers. So here's paper one with some additional information, so that even if you did attend that live event, we hope that you'll find it useful. So in response to feedback from teachers, we decided that this feedback would be most useful if we focused on extended response questions. So we are going to be looking particularly at the taxonomy or command words, and how students can tailor their responses to the demands of the mark schemes that go with those, and an opportunity for teachers to practice applying those level-based mark schemes to then enable them to teach students to meet the requirements of the exam better. So the paper one segment of this feedback training has been written by one of our senior examiners, Sandeep Gill, and it takes three of the extended response questions from paper one from summer 2022, two 8 markers, and the 12 marker issues and debates question from the end of the paper. So we really advise you to use the examiner's reports, and if you've not already studied those in detail, then you can download them from the qualification page on the Edexcel website. These are locked, so you do need to have an Excel online login, which your exams manager, exams officer can sort for you if you don't have one. But these are some kind of highlight headlines taken from the paper one examiner's report, which really apply to all three papers. One of the bits of feedback that teachers have given us is that it's a struggle for students to write all they would like to on paper one in particular. And I think that good advice here from the examiners is that the more students have practiced writing under that kind of time pressure, the better. Now, we are reluctant to give guidance on exactly how long students should spend on a question of a given length, because it will depend on their individual strengths and abilities, and how much they know about each question and the exact wording of each question. But as a very rough guide, I think it's useful for students to be aware that if they were to divide the length of the paper by the number of marks available, then they would have only a little over a minute per mark, and therefore for an 8-mark question, then 11 or perhaps 12 minutes is really the longest they have to answer that. Now, their instinct will probably be to write a lot more, certainly if they're set those kind of questions to answer for homework without time pressure, then they can write in that time. They're much better off, though, spending only the time that is really available for each question and having enough time to write an answer to every question. So I think getting them to practice in lessons and only spending perhaps 15 minutes at first, but then reducing that down to 12 or 11 minutes when they get closer to the exam, so they get a feel for how much they can write and how they can best use the limited time available, is going to really help them. Obviously, understanding what the command words or taxonomy words are looking for is key, and students really need to know the difference between discuss and evaluate, for example. The difference between evaluate and assess, and to what extent, we'll talk about later on, and it's much more subtle, but the key difference in discuss being an AO1, AO2 term is key, I think. Focus on evaluation and evaluation questions is something which a lot of students neglect. They find the AO1, knowledge and understanding, easier. They tend to focus more on that, and they would gain a lot more marks if they gave at least equal space to the evaluation. And developing of arguments is a key skill to really take them up into the higher levels, as we will see. So our first extended response question is question 6 from paper 1. in the summer of 2022. It's this open evaluate question. They can refer to whichever cognitive contemporary study they have looked at, and evaluate here is an AO1, AO3 term. 8 markers always have an equal split between those, so 4 marks of AO1, 4 marks of AO3. I'll remove my video for the next section and give you a chance to pause if you would like and read the first part of the answer. So this candidate has chosen to evaluate Schmolk's study. Pause now if you'd like to read this on screen, or you can download all of the exemplars from this and the other papers feedback training from the comments below this video. So before we move on to look at the rest of the answer, a quick comment to make here is that this first page is all AO1 description. A good question raised was regarding advice for students. Is it better to deal with it this way? Do all of the outline, all of the AO1, followed by all of the evaluation? And there's no right answer to that. It really depends on students' preferences and the particular question they're answering. What I would say about this one is that this candidate has used the AO1 then AO3 separate approach very well. They could perhaps have written fewer words and saved some time if they had interleaved the two, which might make more sense when you've seen the rest of the answer. Pause again if you'd like to have a read of page 2. And I will now give a bit of commentary on this answer. So AO1 is basically finished just at the halfway point of this page, and then the second paragraph is where the evaluation, the AO3, begins. I'd like to pick out on a few useful linking phrases which this student has used, which illustrate, I think, what the mark schemes are looking for when they talk about logical chains of reasoning. So which means that, and for example, show that the student understands the logical connection between these ideas, which is really good. These bits highlighted in blue show that they really understand how the evaluation they're giving relates to this particular study. So they identify examples of potential extraneous variables which can be controlled with the match pairs design. They show they understand that if they weren't controlled, they would affect the dependent variable rather than the independent variable affecting the dependent. So there's really good understanding there. Again, therefore is a good linking phrase. We had a good question raised about competing arguments. What does the exam mark scheme mean by that? Well, here we have an example. A competing argument is a counter argument or a contrasting point which is being made here. Again, may have been the reason, showing that they understand that logical connection, and finally they bring it back to the actual theory that is being assessed in the study. So there's some impressive evaluation going on there. Pause again if you'd like to finish reading this answer. So this one finishes here with another paragraph of evaluation. It's not as strong as the previous one. I'd like to pick out an issue with this word ungeneralizable, where I think, as is quite common, the candidate has been too strong with this criticism. It may well be that there are issues with generalizability, or caution needs to be exercised when generalizing in this case, but to say it's ungeneralizable is going too far, I think, and this has contributed to a less balanced and less kind of logically constructed paragraph here, although it still does have some good linking together with "this means that," which is a phrase well used by this candidate. Okay, on the next slide we will have a look at the levels. We'll now have a look at the level-based mark scheme for this question. So pause now if you'd like to consider what mark you would give it before I start to give commentary. Okay, so the AO1 in this answer is detailed and accurate. It definitely meets the requirements for level 4. I think feedback for a candidate writing this kind of response could be that actually there's more there than they needed to get into the top mark band for AO1. They've written well over a side of A4, and realistically they don't have time to do that for all the extended response questions on this paper, so they could have been more concise and perhaps left out a little bit of the detail and still got into that top band. Now the level 3 here, the AO3 was judged to be a level 3. Now one of the interesting questions that was raised was during our live training was about conclusions and whether conclusions need to come at the end of the answer. The answer to that, confirmed by our senior examiners, is definitely not. Students do not need an explicit conclusion paragraph at the end of their answer, which ties together all the loose ends and gives a judgment. So this answer did contain, particularly at the end of page 2, or in that second paragraph on page 2, what we would call mini conclusions, which were well developed. They were also balanced in that they showed awareness of competing arguments. It's really the fact that the final paragraph on page 3 was less well constructed, less logical, and not really balanced when it got onto that generalizability issue. So that brought it down to level 3 evaluation. But if they'd continued in the same vein as their previous paragraph on page 2, then that could easily have been top band. So balance does not require an equal number of positive and negative points. It's a much more holistic judgment on the part of the examiner. It's really just that they do consider alternative viewpoints, limitations as well as strengths, for example. That's all that balance means in terms of conclusions, and the conclusions can be made as they go, just really making evaluative judgments in those paragraphs. So our best fit approach is taken to marking. A good question which was asked in our live training was what would happen if the AO1 was judged to be only level 1, or actually much more likely if the AO3 was judged to be only level 1, but the AO1 was judged to be level 4. Well then it would either be a level 2 or a level 3 response overall, and the examiners would look at the kind of holistic judgment, the question overall, and decide whether it was just one side of the line or the other. Here, with level 4 AO1 and level 3 AO3, they could have gone for level 3 or 4 overall, but felt that on balance this was just strong enough to go into the top band, and it was 7 out of 8 because the level 3 wasn't quite as strong as the AO1. So the next question we're looking at is an 8-mark discuss question. The examiner's report for this question highlights 2 common issues that led to candidates scoring low marks. One was a lack of understanding of what correlational research involves, with students getting confused, for example, writing about control groups which weren't relevant. The other was not understanding what discuss as a command word means. So in all Edexcel Psychology A-level questions, discuss means AO1 and AO2. It means here show knowledge and understanding of correlational research methods and explain how Janelle would use those in the context given. And this is a question that has a bit more information about what Janelle's investigating. So I'll give you a moment to pause if you'd like to. So here we have a opening to the question which focuses on what correlation research involves. And then in the second half of this page, we move on to Janelle. I'd like to just pick out again a few useful phrases. So this is because, therefore, this would result in showing, again, logical chains of reasoning, so connections between ideas which show that the student really understands why, in this case, something would be done when conducting a piece of research. We also have childhood experiences and nicotine use, so specific details from the context which have been used excuse me, to place the knowledge in context rather than simply dropping Janelle's name in, which would not be enough here. Pause if you'd like to read the final page of this response, which continues here with some more AO1 knowledge and understanding of correlational research, and then returns to Janelle and the AO2 application in the final paragraph. Now, an error is made here which produced some good questions about how positive marking works when there is a requirement for accuracy in the levels-based mark scheme. And like so many things, this is really a judgment that examiners need to make based on individual answers. In this case, the student wasn't really penalised for writing concordance rates when they meant correlation coefficient. The feedback from our senior examiners is that if the mistake is judged to not really detract from the overall sense of the answer, if it's clear that the student does understand correlation coefficients in this case, which they do, because everything they've written is accurate except for the word concordance creeping in there, and because concordance rates and correlation coefficients are both they're both effectively numbers between 0 and 1 or 0 and 100%. They're quite similar concepts. They weren't sort of penalised too much for this. In general, we've not included the indicative content bullet points from the mark schemes in this presentation. You can, of course, download the full mark schemes from the qualification page. But here, I think it's worth having a quick look. Firstly, just to stress that although there are 8 bullet points here for an 8-mark question, there is not a mark per bullet point, and students do not need to include all of the points. It's an indicator, hence the term indicative content, of what they could write. But I think it would be very useful to show this kind of mark scheme to students and point out that for every one of these AO1 points, there is a corresponding AO2 point. So we see like the knowledge that is being looked for in general terms, and then in the AO2 list how that particular point could be applied in this case. Pause if you'd like to consider this before I go through the levels. Okay, so despite that that error with the concordance rate, this was judged to be thorough, accurate knowledge and understanding, good enough to get into level 4, perhaps only just into level 4, but still there was enough detail there that was accurate. And the level 3 actually is level 3. Now, there were some good questions asked about this grasp of competing arguments phrase, and we sought clarification from senior examiners on this. Their response was that in the interests of kind of clarity and predictability, these level-based mark schemes are generic, so they're always identical to this for an 8-mark discussed question. A downside of that is that not every statement in the mark scheme will be strictly relevant to every question. So in this response, you could talk about different ways that correlational techniques could be applied to this context, but actually it's not necessary, and the best advice for students is to think about what the question is asking, really focus on that. In some AO2 discuss questions, then awareness of competing arguments might well be a route to effective application of the material, but it's not necessarily going to be required in every example. So here, the judgment was that some of the application was a little superficial, and some more detail, some more kind of explicit links could have been made, but that was good enough for level 3, and the overall judgment follows. So very similar to the previous response. Perhaps here the AO1 isn't quite so strongly in level 4, but the AO2 is perhaps quite close to level 4, strong level 3 application. So overall this was judged to be at the lower end of level 4, and that's 7 out of 8. Now there is another exemplar response to this same question in the examiner's report, which is perhaps worth a look at. It's also 7 out of 8, but for that one the AO1 is level 3 and the AO2 is level 4, so that might be an interesting comparison if you want to really dig down into this mark scheme. Our final question for our paper 1 feedback is the last question on the paper, question 13. It's the 12-mark issues and debates question that you see here. Now, there's another type of 12-mark question that comes up on paper 3, again in issues and debates. So far in this specification, if you look back at the past papers, you'll see that the paper 1 question worth 12 marks has always been, like this one, 12 marks divided between AO1 and AO3 equally. Unlike the 16 and 20 mark questions on the other papers where there are more marks for AO3 than for AO1, all of these extended response questions on paper 1 are looking for a balance, equal amounts of AO1 and either AO2 for discuss questions or AO3. I did suggest it would always be the case when I was delivering the live training that this would be a 6+6 question. Now that's not actually set in stone, it's not defined by the specification, so they could ask a question with context and make this a 4+4+4, but I think that when there's no context, then it's useful to tell students that this should be like a longer version of an 8 marker where they're dividing their time equally between description and evaluation. Now, a very good question that's been raised is, what is the difference between the evaluate, assess, and to what extent command words? Well, here is a look at the level descriptors for evaluation for the top level, so level 4 for a 12-mark or 16-mark question. The feedback from our senior examiners is that these are very subtle differences, really. The command words are assessing the same assessment objectives, so it's quite subtle differences in the mark scheme, and if students approach these questions in broadly the same way, then that won't cause any significant issues. However, it's worth looking at the detail, I think, and so you can see that there's few differences, but the differences are that for evaluation, a balanced conclusion is being looked for, which shows awareness of competing arguments. With assess and to what extent, an actual judgment is being looked for by the examiners. So in other words, the command words assess and to what extent are used where they are being presented with an argument or an idea in the question, and they need to decide whether the evidence supports that or not. Whereas with evaluate, that will be used where it's a more open question, where they're being asked to just present what's good and bad about a method or an explanation. So pause if you would like to have a read of this before I comment. This answer starts with a kind of classic essay introduction. Now, this is credit worthy here. It is gaining AO1 credit, but it's not necessary. So I think a key thing to consider when we're looking at this answer is how could this candidate have scored the same number of marks while spending less time, because this is a long answer. And one thing they could do is leave out that introduction completely and go straight on to Bartlett, the first piece of evidence that's presented below. On to the second page of this response. Pause if you'd like to read it. So here, I'd like to pick out some of the linking phrases, as in previous responses we've looked at for this paper, which show that there's good logical chains of reasoning and consideration of competing arguments. But I'll also pick out this key bit of content. So this is where Bartlett's finding or first finding is outlined. Now, again, this candidate has provided some relevant information, but really it's the findings for a question like this which are important. And so they could actually have left out the good stuff they've written about aims and procedures before this point, and with perhaps some slight rewording here, perhaps slightly lengthening the bit that I've highlighted, they could have just gone straight in with what Bartlett found and saved a great deal of writing while still getting the key content across. Here we've got indication of good linking. That being said, another nice little phrase to introduce a competing argument here. And again, there's a finding which is clearly outlined very helpfully there. This suggests that. And this green section I've highlighted at the end of the paragraph is a good example of a kind of mini conclusion. In this case, a judgment is being given. And as previously stated in this video, candidates do not need, even for a 12 marker, to finish with an explicit conclusion that reaches a judgment. What's important is that balanced judgments like this one are being included as they go, and at the end of each paragraph is a perfectly good way of doing so. However, here we introduce an alternative point of view again, so more good evidence of competing arguments. On to page 3. Pause if you'd like to read this before I comment further. So again, we have good evidence here of linking logical chains of reasoning, what's being highlighted, what's following on from what. That being said, and a nice phrase again, this suggests that. And here we have another very good, well-reasoned, supported by evidence, judgment being made about the relative importance of different factors. Finally, this answer finishes with this conclusion. Now, as previously stated, they did not need to do this. It is quite a useful conclusion, so it's not a complete waste of their time. And if at the end of this this paper a candidate does have time to write this kind of summative paragraph, then that's great. However, if we were looking at a way to make this answer about half as long while still getting into the same mark band, then potentially they could have left this out because really the judgments and conclusions which are present here, whilst very good, are really repeating ideas that they've clearly given. They do not need to do that. So pause if you'd like to decide what mark you would give before I comment on the levels here. Okay, so this was a very strong answer. The knowledge and understanding is certainly accurate and thorough. As I've mentioned, they've included some details that weren't really necessary to answer this question. That's partly why the answer was so long, but everything that they've included is accurate. And this would also meet the top descriptor for evaluation. We've got competing arguments, balanced response, which had all of those contrasting points of view putting forward, but also we've got judgments and decisions being made throughout. So that's top quality evaluation. And so this mark was awarded full marks. And yeah, apart from being rather long, it's a great exemplar. But yeah, a useful exercise, I hope, to consider how it could have been made shorter whilst retaining that quality. Thank you for watching that recording of exam feedback training on paper 1, paper 2 and paper 3 recordings will also be available, and you can find those linked below in the comments for this video. And links to these pages and contact forms on the Edexcel website should also be in the comments below this video. Thank you.